Now that's cool, but again, one of the things is, so if we do a little bit more extreme here, that's great, but we are carving out a large section of the frequency spectrum there on the bass, and maybe we don't want to do that the entire time, because maybe there's a section, I don't believe it is in this track, but let's say that maybe there was a section where this sub wasn't playing, but the bass was still active. We probably want to have that, retain that, the full energy of that bass sound. So what we can do is, well, we'll jump here. EQ in Neutron, every single node can either be static or dynamic. So an EQ that's actually reacting to the incoming audio signal. Static nodes are just going to be stuck in their place, as a standard EQ is. It's really good for just sort of overall coloration and if you're notching out particularly unwanted resonances. Dynamic nodes, however, are, again, adapting to the incoming audio signal. And in Neutron, you can sidechain these dynamic nodes. So if we go over to the bass now, I'm going to open up the Neutron instantiation on the bass, and likewise, we can see that same EQ cut that we created. I'm going to switch this back to flat logarithmic so we can have better visual resolution here. So what we're going to do is switch this into the dynamic mode with this little button down here, and you'll see as well, if you watch the shape here, it switches from just that circle, that dot, into this down arrow, which is indicating that it's going to be compressing that region. Now, one thing to keep in mind is a dynamic EQ is distinct. It is similar in concept to a multiband compressor. However, dynamic EQ is much more transparent in that with a multiband compressor, you're sending audio through a series of bandpass filters, high pass, low pass. So by definition, you are coloring the signal. A dynamic EQ, you could almost think is just an EQ that's being automated really, really quick. So if it's not doing anything, like not cutting or boosting, it's not touching the audio at all. So it's a very transparent way of going about it. So here, we're going to sidechain that EQ cut off of the bass drum. So what we're going to do is load up the sidechain. So here, we're going to want to make sure we get the correct one. And this is the kick sub. And we are going to make sure that this is in dynamic mode and compress that way. It's going to pull back when that kick hits. And here is the key. So down here, we have a bunch of different sidechain options. So we have all of the INT ones, which are internal. So essentially, if I wanted this band to cut when band 3's energy was really high, we could sidechain it from there. But here, we're going to go with external sidechain band 1. So now it's cutting, as we can see, when that kick drum hits. So let's see, it's going to be very subtle, but let's check it out in the mix. So this is bypassed. So that's going to make the sub punch through just a little bit more clearly. So that's one way to deal with these issues, is with dynamic EQ, and again, in this particular case, we're using sidechain dynamic EQ. So dealing with the frequency spectrum, of course, is an important part of that. Now, another place that we have some clashing going on in the frequency spectrum is going to be over further down here in the sort of overall synth sound. So if we go into the chorus sound here, we're going to hear that this was probably layered because we have sort of this lower fundamental that's bringing out a lot more energy than the other ones here. And it would help if I made sure to open up the right instantiation of Neutron. So let's open up this one. Cool. So let's take a look here. And we can see we have a fundamental below 100 Hertz, which I probably don't want here because that's really the realm of the bass. And we can sort of, so by holding down the Alt Option key and clicking, you can sort of solo through these different frequencies. And again, that's with the Alt Option key here on a Mac. So what we're gonna do, so for starters, I mean, again, that's taking up a lot of energy from the bass, so let's just do some subtractive EQ cuts here to carve out some space. So that's definitely given a little bit more body to the bass sound because we're taking those frequencies out of the synth sound. One thing to keep in mind, so here I just used a simple high pass filter. Typically, I guess when we're dealing with electronic music, really you can go pretty steep here. If you're going to be mixing something more acoustic and something, you know, just sort of singer-songwriter kind of thing, with that, one thing that's important to keep in mind is typically we're going to use more gentle sort of filter shapes with that. So typically you're going to use like 12 dB, rarely 24 dB per octave. But again, with electronic music, it's not so much of a big deal. So here we can use a more steep sort of cutoff. So that's given a little bit more energy to the bass there by cutting those frequencies out of the synth. So we've dealt with dynamic EQ and static EQ to sort of carve out additional space for these different frequencies and different instruments.